Today we are going to have our third keynote speaker, Dr. Marian Feldman. So Marian Feldman holds a joint appointment in the Department of the History of Art and the Near Eastern Studies. She received her PhD in art history at Harvard University in ancient Near Eastern art and concentrates on the arts of the late 3rd, 2nd, and the 1st millennium BCE in the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean. Her interests range from questions regarding the role of the arts in the cultural interactions and collective memory of issues of style, object agencies, materiality, and space. Professor Feldman has held fellowship at the Institution for Archaeological Research at the University of Freiburg in the Internationalist College Morphomate at the University of Cologne and the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavior Science at Stanford University from 2008 to 2009. She was recently a co-PI on the project Material Entanglements in the Ancient Mediterranean and Beyond, funded by the Getty Foundation Connecting Art Histories Initiative from 2017 to 2020. She was a Getty Foundation Connecting Art Histories visiting professor at Boğaziçi University, Istanbul, and a visiting professor at the University of Heidelberg. She taught in the History of Art and Near Eastern Studies departments at the University of California, Berkeley, before coming to Johns Hopkins in 2013. So today, for the session, she will be sharing her views on the display and the reception of Akkadian period from circa 2350 to 2150 BCE, royal monuments in later Mesopotamian history. So, Dr. Stephen.
Okay, so I just need to share my screen. Do that. The kings of the Akkadian period, who ruled from around 2350 to 2150 BCE, were remembered for thousands of years by later people of Mesopotamia. Mostly this memory was passed down through the medium of literature, which preserved legends of the founder of the Akkadian dynasty, Sargon, known in scholarship today as Sargon the Great, and his grandson Naram-Sin. But material remains of these rulers also persisted through the ages and were re-encountered by later people in a variety of different contexts. These material remains, stone statues in the round and carved stelae, continued to be displayed, studied, and even captured as war booty for almost 2,000 years before finally succumbing to abandonment and burial in the accumulated debris that comprises the modern archaeological mounds of today's Middle East. Material remains play a critical role in the formation and promulgation of memory, and large state-sponsored monuments made of durable materials contribute especially to memories held among groups of people, a so-called collective memory. In the 1980s, the social historian Paul Connerton explored the notion of collective memory and how it was conveyed and sustained through cultural production. He focused specifically on the period of the French Revolution in the 18th century of our era, but his conclusions are relevant for any time and place, and his scholarship has been especially important for studying the way the past has been encountered and remembered in the past. For Connerton, individuals form ties with larger groups through their participation in ceremonial activities involving human-object interactions. The material objects in their physical presence that transcends ephemeral interactions provide images of permanence and stability. Among these objects, Connerton distinguishes between what he calls inscribed versus incorporated practices. Inscribed practices entail highly self-conscious acts of identity expression, such as written text or visual representations. Incorporated practices belong more to the realm of habit and custom that make up muscle memory and felt bodily experiences. Material remains of inscribed practices tend to be quite evident and call attention to themselves through their text and/or visual features. Incorporated practices can be more difficult to identify in the archaeological remains. They depend on reconstructing a sense of engagement between human individuals and atmospheric environments comprised of material remains. By means of the Akkadian monuments, it is possible for us to trace some of the inscribed practices that serve to sustain and shape the later memory of the Akkadian period and its rulers. It is trickier to trace incorporated practices by which the Akkadian period is taken up into the habitual practices of later Mesopotamians, but echoes can be found in later artworks. Recently, Melissa Eppiheimer has pursued related questions regarding the legacy of Akkadian period royal arts through the course of Mesopotamian history, and this talk engages closely with her ideas, while also drawing on my own forthcoming book on the topic. The talk follows some of the royal monuments commissioned by Akkadian rulers as they move through time from the period immediately following the Akkadian dynasty at the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, down to the middle of the 1st millennium BCE. It sketches the context in which the monuments appear and considers the later period's reception of the older works. Some of these monuments have survived in the archaeological record. Others can be identified through textual evidence. Many of them follow complex biographical trajectories. The Akkadian state was established under the first ruler of its dynasty, Sargon, who around 2350 BCE, and I should say that our handle on precise dates is not very good for this early period, so I'm using just rough dates. So around 2350 BCE, Sargon claimed rulership of all of southern Mesopotamia. As far as we are aware, this was the first time that a king had successfully brought under single rule all the various independent city-states that made up the regions known as Sumer in the far south and Akkad to the north in central Mesopotamia. Sargon himself seems to have come out of the court of the king of Kish, and it appears that he built a newly founded capital called Agade. This capital remains unexcavated, and its precise location is debated. Sargon's dynasty, including his grandson Naram-Sin, who deifies himself during his lifetime, ruled for only around 150 years, but it lived on in the imagination of later Mesopotamians. Very few, if any, Akkadian royal sculptures have survived in their original setting. All of them have been moved and tampered with to some degree. A corpus of fragmentary statues in the round of the Akkadian ruler Manish-Tushu, one of Sargon's sons, offers a glimpse at the original context of Akkadian sculpture, as well as speaks to its multiple afterlives. Eppiheimer has assembled all the surviving statue fragments and proposes that they function during Manish-Tushu's reign as a means of binding together the different areas of the newly unified Akkadian state. The statues, though none are complete, and I'm showing you several fragments here on the screen, take the form of seated or standing representations of the king. Their fragments have been recovered from sites around Mesopotamia, including Sippar, Nippur, and Uruk, as well as outside of Mesopotamia in Elam, where they were taken to the city of Susa by a 12th century Elamite ruler after he conducted raids on several Mesopotamian cities. I'll come back to the Elamite looting in a moment, but what is noteworthy here is that the Elamite king added inscriptions to several fragments, which note the locations from which he took the pieces, including the still undiscovered Akkadian capital of Agade. Going back to the time of the Akkadian rulers, it appears that Manish-Tushu set these up throughout his newly unified realm, and as such, they served as a means of generating a collective memory of what it meant to be an Akkadian ruler, and especially the ambitions of a large territorial state. Of particular note is the high degree of standardization seen among these statues, which, as Eppiheimer's research has demonstrated, share numerous features such as material, which is this hard black stone, often identified as diorite, their dimensions, which are approximately life-size, and stylistic details. In addition, Manish-Tushu had the statues inscribed with the same text that recounts their dedication. This standardization ensured that the general appearance of each statue, set up in temple celas around Mesopotamia, would be experienced similarly by people throughout the territory of the new state, effectively creating a collective memory through the inscribed practices of the statue's production, dedication, and subsequent ritual context. The standardization also stood out in its distinctiveness from statuary of the preceding period, known as the early dynastic period, which tended to be much smaller in scale, made out of soft, pale gypsum stones, and represented individuals from a more diverse set of social statuses. And I'm showing you just a few of them here on the right. The end of the Akkadian state, somewhere around 2150 BCE, is clouded in uncertainty. Later legends, especially the composition known as the Curse of Agade, attribute its collapse to a group of outsiders, the Gutians, who were able to destroy the capital city after the city's patron goddess, Ishtar, abandoned it. From the breakdown of the Akkadian territorial state arose several smaller city-states, including that of Lagash. Following in the tradition of Manish-Tushu, the ruler of Lagash, Gudea, commissioned a series of seated and standing statues of himself, made out of hard black stone and inscribed with long dedicatory text. Also, like Manish-Tushu's statues, these were not discovered in their original locations. Rather, they had been collected by a much later official from the Hellenistic period. But it is clear from their lengthy inscriptions that they were erected in numerous temples throughout the city-state. While in certain fundamental ways they differ from the Akkadian precedents, most notably in the attire and hairstyle, you don't actually see the hairstyle in either of these images, which are missing their heads, they reveal the incorporated practices of large-scale, extremely durable statuary set up in sacred spaces. Without pointing directly to the Akkadians, Gudea's statues subtly convey a sense of power, stability, and durability through the same qualities seen in Manish-Tushu's statues, a faint echo rather than an explicit statement. Lagash's independence was short-lived, and it was soon absorbed into an expanding territorial state ruled from the city of Ur, known today as the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur-3 for short. The founder of the dynasty, Ur-Nama, and his son Shulgi engaged in a massive building program throughout their new state. The most radical of their architectural interventions was the ziggurat, a series of stepped platforms on top of which sat the temple. At least 4 almost identical ziggurat complexes were constructed in Mesopotamia by Ur-Nama and Shulgi. The best known is the one dedicated to the moon god Nana at Ur, but examples were also constructed for the goddess Inanna at Uruk, the god Enki at Eridu, and the chief Sumerian deity Enlil at Nippur. These building programs radically changed the landscape of the cities in which they were erected, and at least at Nippur, we know that they destroyed an elaborate temple complex from the Akkadian period. Yet we know that during this period, shrines were established to worship the earlier Akkadian rulers, and many of the legends about them appear to have first been composed during this time. These legends, like the Curse of Agade, offer some of the clearest evidence for inscribed practices contributing to the collective Mesopotamian memory of the Akkadian Golden Age. We can also be pretty certain that Akkadian sculpture, which as we saw in the case of Manish-Tushu's was set up around Mesopotamia, was retained by the Ur-3 rulers, who apparently displayed them anew in their newly built ziggurat complexes. Again, we have limited evidence from actual in situ examples, although a small fragment of a larger stone monument bearing an inscription of the Akkadian king Naram-Sin has recently been excavated in an Ur-3 period temple courtyard at the site of Tulu al-Bakarat, thought to be the religious center of Kesh. However, the Ur-3 temple complexes, though built new at this time, remained in use for the next 1,500 years, and we have evidence that Akkadian royal statues continued to be displayed in their temple courtyards hundreds of years later, a point to which I will return momentarily. The inscribed nature of the statues, however, also participated in ceremonial and ritual activities carried out in the temple spaces. And I'm showing you this reconstruction just to give you a kind of speculative idea of what these kinds of ritual activities might look like. And these contribute to incorporated practices surrounding the new or-3 spaces of display, which in turn affected the memory of Akkad. In effect, we have a merging of inscribed and incorporated practices that will continue to shape the memory of the Akkadian state from then on. We cannot separate these from one another. As I just mentioned, evidence exists for a continued engagement with both the inscribed monuments of the Akkadian kings, as well as the more incorporated aspects of their memory, as curated first by the or-3 rulers. This evidence takes the form of clay tablets on which collections of statue inscriptions were assembled by scribes during the early 2nd millennium BCE, something like 400 years after the Akkadian period. The largest group of these tablets comes from Nippur, although there are also examples from Ur. In addition to collecting the inscriptions that were carved on the royal statues, several of them provide information about the location of the inscription on the monument and the location of the monument itself. For example, one collection specifies that they come from statues in the courtyard of the ziggurat complex at Nippur, known as the Ikor. Others indicate that the inscriptions were found on the base or on an arm. Giorgio Bucciolati has reconstructed one of these statues according to the inscriptions and with comparison to surviving statue fragments, such as those of Manish Tushu, and I'm showing you that on the left. It is important to keep in mind that these collections of inscriptions represent an intellectual engagement on the part of the scribes with these earlier monuments. In other words, a highly inscribed practice in almost every possible way. We have to imagine the scribes moving among the statues within the temple courtyards, looking closely at them and copying their inscriptions carefully. We know that they were precise in their work because their copies match actual Akkadian period sculptural fragments, such as the one found at Tulu al-Bakarat, which records a campaign that is also found on one of these tablet collections. This highly conscious engagement connected the scribes to the Akkadian past, which they in turn passed along for the future. At the same time, their bodily experiences, standing in the great open courtyards of the ziggurat complexes in which the statues now stood, reshaped their understanding of this past in ways that most likely escaped their notice. And still, the monuments continued to exist in these temple courtyards for several hundreds of years more. Our next glimpse comes from a corpus of sculpture excavated at the royal Elamite city of Susa in southwestern Iran. Already mentioned earlier in conjunction with inscribed fragments of Manish Tushu, these objects represent the military booty of an Elamite ruler, Shutruk-Nahunta, who around 1155 BCE conducted a series of raids on Babylonian cities. In several cases, it is possible to track the monuments back to their original location, according to either an Akkadian period inscription or an inscription that Shutruk-Nahunta added. For example, Shutruk-Nahunta noted on the Manish Tushu fragments already discussed that they came from the cities of Agade and Eshnuna. He boasts, quote, "I conquered Agade. I took the statue of Manish Tushu and brought it to Elam," end quote. We can assume then that these statues stood in the temple courtyards of the Babylonian cities circa 1155 BCE. One monument in particular allows us to trace its wanderings, the so-called Victory Stele of Naram Sin. The nearly 7-foot-tall sandstone monument survives almost complete. Only the bottom portion is broken away. The irregularly shaped stone slab is carved on the front with a triumphant scene of Naram Sin trampling his enemy high on a mountaintop. His army climbs the steep slope behind him while the enemies tumble in defeat. Just above Naram Sin, who wears a horned headdress indicating his newly divinized status, a partially preserved inscription recounts his military success over people of the Zagros Mountains in western Iran. It reads, The divine Naram Sin, the mighty, and then it breaks off. The Highlanders of Luliboom assembled together, and another break, and a battle, another break, and then he heaped up a burial mound over them and dedicated the stele to the god whose name is unfortunately broken. When Shutruk-Nahunta looted the stele, he added an inscription alongside the existing inscription and carved relief. It reads, I am Shutruk-Nahunta, son of Halitush in Shushanak, beloved servant of the god in Shushanak, king of Anshan and Susa, enlarger of my realm, protector of Elam, prince of Elam. At the command of the god in Shushanak, I struck down the city of Sippar. I took the stele of Naram Sin in my hand, and I carried it off and brought it back to Elam. I set it up in dedication to my lord in Shushanak. Shutruk-Nahunta's inscription is revealing on a number of levels. First, it tells us that Naram Sin's stele stood in Sippar in the 12th century and was accessible enough for it to be seized during a fairly quick military raid. Because of the three astral symbols on the top of the stele, which remain difficult to interpret but appear to be solar symbols, and because the main temple in Sippar is dedicated to the sun god Shamash, it seems likely that the stele was originally erected by Naram Sin in Sippar over 1,000 years earlier. It is also likely that whatever temple context it originally adorned saw architectural changes, either renovations or complete rebuilds, as in the Ur-3 ziggurat complexes. In either case, the stele had been protected, preserved, and presumably still displayed for this long period of time. Second, it shows us that Naram Sin and the Akkadian past were still known and appreciated 1,000 years later. Shutruk-Nahunta makes a point of recording that the stele belonged to Naram Sin. Moreover, he refrains from erasing Naram Sin's name in the original inscription, nor does he deface the ruler's image, an occurrence we see in other instances in which intentional mutilation marks the successful conquest of one ruler over another. Last, the dedication of the monument in its new but still mostly intact state to the chief city of Elam in Shushanak indicates that the stele was considered a worthy item. Thus, we can track Shutruk-Nahunta's interest in and knowledge of the Akkadians by means of his engagement with the monument. However, we might want to consider Naram Sin's stele and the memory of the Akkadian state from a slightly different perspective. Shutruk-Nahunta does not claim to be part of the Babylonian dynastic tradition to which the Akkadian rulers belonged. He is the ruler of the land of Elam, which encompasses two major cities, Susa and Anshan, in what is today southwestern Iran, and Anshan falls off of this map to the east. This region, and especially the city of Susa, had a long history of its own, going back before the Akkadian dynasty. Over thousands of years, Susa had complex interactions with southern Mesopotamia, at times working closely together and at other times in opposition. Shutruk-Nahunta's raid on several Mesopotamian cities highlights the more antagonistic nature of the relationship in the 12th century BCE. Indeed, during the Akkadian period, Susa had come under Akkadian rule as the kings expanded their territorial conquests beyond the boundaries of Babylonia proper. Moreover, the conquests celebrated on the monument took place nearby in the Zagros mountain range of western Iran. Thus, the appropriation of Naram Sin's stele and its erection in the Elamite temple of Shushanak can be seen as a retort to the general political power of Babylonia 1,000 years later. This rebuke takes on clear material shape by means of the physical placement of Shutruk-Nahunta's inscription. The text appears to emanate out from the mouth of a pleading enemy. So while this figure, this pleading enemy, was originally intended to be viewed with pity at what was presumably an unsuccessful supplication for Naram Sin's mercy, he's now been turned into a boast of the expropriation of the monument. Elam now is the victor who has carried off the plunder of Babylonia. Akkad itself dedicated large numbers of objects plundered during its conquest, including many mace heads said to have been looted from Elam. Intriguingly, Naram Sin's memory, even within Mesopotamia, is not entirely rosy. While cults were established to worship him, and several later rulers chose to take his throne name, he is also remembered in the literary sphere as the cause of the Akkadian state's demise. In The Curse of Agade, Naram Sin is depicted as an impetuous upstart. He wants to build a temple for the goddess Inanna, who has shifted her patronage from an older city to the new capital of Agade. However, for reasons that are not entirely clear from the preserved composition, Naram Sin's petition to the chief god Enlil for permission to build the temple is denied. After waiting some time, Naram Sin again seeks permission through the means of extispacy. But again, the omens are unfavorable. At this point, according to the legend, Naram Sin defies the gods and attacks and plunders Enlil's temple in Nippur. In retaliation for this offense, Enlil sends the Gutians to attack Agade. Ishtar abandons the city, and it is destroyed along with the Akkadian dynasty. Scholars debate how to interpret the negative picture drawn of Naram Sin in this literary text, which appears to have been first composed during the Ur III period that immediately followed the fall of the Akkadian state. The tale is certainly not historically accurate, as we know that Naram Sin was succeeded by his son Shar-Kali Shari, who, though not remembered by later Mesopotamians, did continue several building projects begun by his father. Political imperatives probably conditioned the curation of the memory of the Akkadian kings, at least at the level of state-sponsored arts and literature. The Curse of Agade, however, is one of the most popular literary texts in the second millennium, and the negative opinion of Naram Sin must have affected the memory of the Akkadian past in some way that nevertheless was able to sit alongside more glorifying accounts. These literary legends and appropriations of ancient monuments are all highly inscribed practices. They call attention to themselves and their monumentality and their written references to specific rulers. But there also appears to have been a more incorporated aspect of the Akkadian memory, one transmitted through more of a sense or feeling from the past. Such a vague notion is, of course, much harder to pin down and practically impossible to demonstrate. Yet, given the ongoing memories through clear inscribed instances, it seems likely to be there as well. This more nebulous sense seems to be linked generally with an authority conferred by a mytho-historical past in which the Akkadian rulers played a large but not exclusive part. The genre of object known as the cylinder seal offers a possible case for thinking about the incorporated memory of the Akkadian period. Cylinder seals, small spool-shaped items carved in reverse intaglio in order to make a raised image when impressed, first appeared in Mesopotamia with the emergence of writing and large-scale bureaucratic practices at the end of the 4th millennium BCE. Seals were impressed on malleable surfaces such as clay and included sealings for jars, boxes, and even whole rooms, as well as written text. They continued to be used over the 3,000-year history of cuneiform writing on clay tablets, although specifics of size, material, style, imagery, and administrative function varied from period to period. During the Akkadian period, under Naram Sin and Shar-Kali Shari, numerous institutional reforms were put into place, such as standardized weights and a uniform calendar. These were meant to facilitate administrative centralization and economic interactions across the growing Akkadian state, and were marked by increasing standardization. Cylinder seals played a central role in the administration, as is seen in a group of seals that were commissioned by the king and given to his officials for their use in royal business. These seals are of the highest quality of carving and made of large exotic stones, such as agate and green serpentine. One of the most common images features two pairs of standing contestants, usually heroic nude figure with 6 curls known as lakmu, who you see here. The upper left, you see him, and then on the bottom, he's fighting lions. The deeply carved stones create high relief impressions, and the fine execution translates into crisp detail. While the seals continue a tradition begun in the previous period of upright contest scenes, such as this one you see on the bottom, the Akkadian seals are distinguished by pulling apart the formerly entwined contestants so that each one has its own space, in contrast to the patterning created in the earlier seal. Another group of Akkadian seals depicts mythological scenes, a new addition to the repertoire of seal imagery. We can rarely identify specific myths, with a few exceptions, such as the myth of Etana, which tells the story of Etana, a legendary king of Kish, who flew on the back of an eagle up to heaven in search of a plant that would help his wife have a child, which you see on the bottom seal. These mythological seals have been associated with a unification of the divine world to parallel that of the earthly world under the Akkadian dynasty. And they speak to an interest in narrating complex stories in visual, if not yet in written form. Cylinder seals continued to be used in Mesopotamia until the end of cuneiform writing in the first millennium BCE. The small stone objects moved around in unusual ways, sometimes as heirlooms, but also randomly encountered. It is possible that Akkadian seals, distinctive in their depiction of physicality and complex narratives, entered into a tradition that found expression during other times of territorial conquest. For example, at the end of the second millennium BCE, in the 14th and 13th centuries, the city of Ashur began to expand through military force into neighboring areas. Its rulers assumed the title of Great King and King of the Four Quarters, a title echoing that of the Akkadian rulers. And its administrative seals also echo those of the Akkadian period. For one, they draw upon related forms of muscular corporality in their depiction of volumetric bodies. For another, they incorporate more complex storytelling on seals than had been the case since the Akkadian period, such as scenes of animals traversing landscapes. Later, in the 8th century, an Assyrian king who appears to have come to the throne indirectly, similar to Sargon, takes the name Sargon upon his ascension. Sargon II moved the Assyrian capital to a small backwater locale known today as Khorsabad, which he named Dur-Shurikin, or Fortress of Sargon. The palace that he built there is larger and more elaborately decorated than his forefathers at the old capital of Nimrud, ornamented with massive carved stone reliefs depicting his military campaigns and large protective figures set up in doorways and along major courtyard facades. It is noteworthy that the stone sculptures that decorate Sargon's palace, while following in the tradition of his predecessors, include on a monumental scale the figure of the Lakhmu hero, and are executed in much higher relief, giving bodies a rounded corporality similar to Akkadian art. The Lakhmu figures that you see an example of here on your right are truly colossal, around 5 meters or 15 feet tall. They stand out from the background stone orthostat to such an extent that they appear almost three-dimensional. Eppheimer has not been able to trace any specific connection between the small Akkadian period seals with Lakhmu contest scenes and the Lakhmu guardians from nearly 1,500 years later, standing in monumental scale on the facade of Sargon II's palace. Instead, she sees notions of Akkadian kingship reaching Assyria through the mediation of earlier Babylonian filters. We might understand this to be an incorporation of Akkadianness that is not necessarily explicit in its legibility, that is, in its inscription, but that is nonetheless felt or sensed to be a heroic tradition. And we know from more explicitly inscribed objects that this heroic tradition is, in part, associated with the Akkadian rulers. For example, the so-called Babylonian map of the world, a small clay tablet, depicts on one side an inscribed diagram of the cosmos, with Babylon marked in the center. The central landmass, which can be understood as the known world, is surrounded by a sea or ocean in the form of a concentric circle. Beyond the ocean are several incised triangles, labeled with the Akkadian term Nagu, or region. On the other side of the tablet, an inscription describes the Nagus as mythical locales. Paul Del Nero has recently proposed an understanding of the map as a dynamic itinerary that spirals around the different geographical entities, both inside and outside of the encircling water. However one reads the map, its mytho-historical connections are clear in the juxtaposing of real geographical locations with the mythical Nagus. How does this relate to a discussion about the memory of the Akkadian rulers? On the front, above the inscribed map, is a fragmentary inscription that mentions various monsters and wild animals, along with mythological heroes. These heroes include Sargon of Agade, as well as figures such as Utnapishtim, known as the Babylonian Noah, who built a boat in order to survive a destructive flood. The tablet is thought to have come from the central Mesopotamian city of Sippar and has been dated to the 6th century BCE paleographically, but is said in the colophon to be a copy of an earlier tablet that may date back to the 9th century BCE. In this late tablet, we see a clear case of the inscribed memory of the Akkadian kings and their association with mytho-cosmological locations. By the time the Babylonian map of the world was copied in the 6th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire had fallen to an allied force of Babylonians in the south and Medians to the east. The two victorious powers divided the immense Assyrian Empire between them, Babylonia taking the western portion and the Medes the eastern. The kings of the Babylonian Empire were particularly interested in their historical past, especially Nabonidus, who reigned towards the end of the 6th century. And Irene Winter refers to these ancient kings as the first archaeologists. From Nabonidus's reign, we hear about excavations conducted to recover the foundations of earlier buildings, including inscribed foundation deposits that identify the past ruler. While these late Babylonian kings boasted of finding the remains of several of their predecessors, there is a marked interest in recovering those of the Akkadians. Nabonidus claims to have discovered the foundations of the Akkadian period temple to Ishtar built in Agade, as well as those built by Naram-Sin for the temple of the sun god Shamash at Sippar. At Sippar, Nabonidus says he followed the Akkadian temple plan exactly, not a finger width off from the original, and that in addition to recovering the foundation deposit inscribed by Naram-Sin, he also discovered a broken statue of Sargon, which he repaired and set up in the new Shamash temple. 19th century excavations at Sippar did not discover the statue of Sargon, but they did uncover a fascinating instance of the ongoing memory of the Akkadian dynasty. Within Nabonidus's temple to Shamash, a unique stone object in the form of a square cross was discovered. And I should mention that David Danzig's talk yesterday touches upon this same temple and Nabonidus's work, but looked at a different object, the sun god tablet. This object, which has been dubbed the cruciform monument, the dark stone is entirely covered in an inscription belonging to the Akkadian king Manish-Tushu. And the piece was originally dated by scholars to this period. However, subsequent philological analysis has shown that the inscription postdates the Akkadian period and most likely dates to the Neo-Babylonian period, perhaps even to the reign of Nabonidus, because it was found buried along with two inscribed clay cylinders of that king. In fact, it has now been proposed that the cruciform monument is an ingenious forgery made in order to tap into the legitimizing aura of the deep past. And just as authentic Akkadian sculptural inscriptions were copied and studied, 3 surviving clay tablets found at Sippar provide evidence that the cruciform monument also entered into the ancient scholarly corpus, despite it being a fake. The colophon of one of these tablets states, "That which is on the monument, written and checked according to an original, baked red copy, which is a copy from the city of Borsippa." suggesting a fairly wide dissemination of the text. What is especially notable is that it is the Akkadian dynasty that provides this legitimation for a Babylonian ruler over 1,500 years later. In another instance, however, we have a literal inscribed remnant from such expeditions. The impression on a clay tablet made by a slightly curved inscribed stone bearing a text of Shar-Kali Shari. On the other side, an inscription from the Neo-Babylonian period records the discovery of the object. It says, impression from a diorite slab of the display inscriptions, which Nabu-Zeru-Lishir, scribe, found in the Hall of Inscriptions of Naram-Sin, the king, in Agade. The impression is in mirror reverse, and it is too big to be from a cylinder seal. Tablets around 4 by 6 centimeters, indicating that it must have originally been part of a display inscription on a piece of sculpture or other dedicatory object. The name Nabu-Zeru-Lishir is known to belong to a scribe from the reign of Nabonidus, and it is likely that this is the individual who impressed the Akkadian text and added his own annotation. The tablet itself, unfortunately, was purchased and does not have a secure excavation find spot, although it is likely that it was from Nippur, despite mentioning the Akkadian capital of Agade as its source. The memory of the Akkadian dynasty continued beyond the Babylonian Empire period, although with the conquest of Babylonia by the Persians in 539 BCE, the interest in connecting oneself to the early Mesopotamian royal lineage appears to wane, and the echoes become fainter through the Persian and Hellenistic periods until they fade away entirely. Thus, over a period of 2,000 years, the memory of the Akkadian dynasty continued through both inscribed and incorporated practices. The clearest of the inscribed practices are the scribal copies of inscriptions from surviving Akkadian statuary, as well as examples of these very same statues found in disparate locales. With the literal inscription of copied text, the memory of the Akkadian kings was perpetuated through time and space. However, as Connerton points out in his book, these repetitions of inscribed practices can never exactly duplicate the past. Rather, the past is continually rewritten with each iteration, including even the eventual forging of an ancient monumental inscription, as seen on the cruciform monument. Incorporated practices, such as ceremonial or ritual activities that take place in spaces filled with Akkadian statues, are harder to discern in the archaeological record, but emerge in the echoes of Akkadian stylistic practices seen in the Middle Assyrian seals or the carved stone reliefs of Sargon II's palace at Khorsabad. Unlike inscribed practices, incorporated practices display more obviously their distance from the original source, again, signaling the ongoing revision of history as its memory is passed forward. The memory of the Akkadian dynasty, however, continues today, and we should not neglect to consider how recent engagements with Akkadian material contribute to our own writing of its history. The Akkadian monuments taken to Elam by Shutruk-Nahunta, such as the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, re-emerged after their millennia-long burial when French archaeologists working in the Middle East excavated the ancient mound of Susa in the late 19th century. At the time, the Middle East as a whole was a desired region for European powers such as England, Germany, and France, who jostled amongst one another for influence with the Ottoman Empire. The acquisition of ancient objects brought back to European capitals for display in newly opened encyclopedic museums like the British Museum and the Musée du Louvre served as a visible proxy for national power and influence. Like Shutruk-Nahunta, the French hauled the Akkadian sculptures, including the Stele of Naram-Sin, back to their capital city. A popular illustrated journal of the time recounted, quote, "At the moment, the lucky can see the excavators in one of the lower rooms of the Louvre, unpacking with infinite care their precious booty. They come and go among the artworks that they have conquered, of which the Stele of King Naram-Sin is one of the most beautiful." And you see it in the background of that photograph from 1902. Indeed, Naram Sin stele has been celebrated since its excavation in 1898. The excavator, Jacques de Morgan, wrote in 1900 that it was without dispute the most remarkable artistic masterpiece from the area. He says, "This relief is incomparable above all for the unity of its composition, though the execution of its details surpasses all that we know about Asiatic sculpture." As one of the earliest discovered representations of an Akkadian ruler, the apparent naturalism of its depiction appeared to perfectly fit a vision of imperial success that the French too were in search of. You may have noticed that throughout this talk, I have referred to the Akkadian dynasty and the Akkadian territorial state, but I have not mentioned an Akkadian empire. There is, in fact, much debate among scholars regarding whether the Akkadian state was a true empire, with good reasons for rejecting that designation. However, the image of Naram Sin standing triumphant on the bodies of dead enemy, his perfect physiognomy and toned musculature, resonated with 19th and early 20th century ideas of what imperialism should look like, contributing to the ongoing legend of the Akkadian Empire today. In conclusion, by tracing the inscribed and incorporated practices of the reception of the Akkadian rulers, we can see how the Akkadian past developed anew in each subsequent period, building upon and reshaping the responses that came before. The secretion of response to and recounting about the Akkadian period complicates our own ability to write a history of the Akkadian period, especially as very little survives from original Akkadian context. Moreover, these accretions continue even today, as Akkadian monuments have been excavated and displayed in museums, highlighting the ongoing recursiveness of ancient material culture in later times and shining a spotlight on the way ancient objects contribute to shifting narratives about the past. Thank you. I stop sharing.
Hi, Dr. Feldman. That was really nice. It was a wonderful presentation of the Akkadian Empire through time and how it kept pushing forward. I have a few questions myself, and we have some questions in the chat also.
Sure.
What other types of media? You referred to steles and monuments, as well as cylinder seals. What other types of media do you think there were that served as vehicles for transmission of old Akkadian ideas, artistic ideas, concepts, and that helped consolidate collective memory of the old Akkadian period in the future?
Yeah, well, monuments is a very nice broad term, so it can encompass a lot. But one type of monument I didn't really talk about because it's not particularly sort of aesthetically exciting, but are these door sockets that were sort of buried in the ground and used for the pivots of door hinges, and that are often inscribed, and that would be found and reused. And so that I think is one more kind of monument. And these foundation deposits, you actually talked about foundation deposits yesterday, where we have figurines and tablets and other precious stones and materials that are buried in the foundations of buildings, and that would then be encountered by the later, generally the later rulers who are renovating the buildings. I think those are other important ways. But then the literary corpus, and one imagines that there was a large oral tradition that attended this, of which we have just bits and pieces that ended up in the scholarly curriculum.
Right. What do you think about the landscape in terms of cities and buildings in cities that might have still been recognizable, but also in terms of place names, toponyms that might have felt very old?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, my forthcoming book deals in some part with that question of architecture, because very little Akkadian architecture survives today, particularly in the South. and my contention is that there was a fairly systematic removal of that architecture by the Ur-3 period rulers. But things like the toponyms, I think, do, like the name Agade continues, and even though its actual location is still very debated, and I conjecture that maybe there's a reason why we can't find it, because it was sort of obliterated. It's sort of periodically rediscovered and refound by much later kings, and how valid those are is a little bit hard to judge. So yeah, I think those were really important mechanisms too.
What about in the north? I know that at Tel Elan there was a big old Akkadian building that I think stood longer, if I'm not correct.
Yeah, in the north, there's much more of a lengthy preservation of the Akkadian period. I mean, at Brock we have material from the Akkadian period, and more stuff is starting to come up with excavations now in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Basetki, ancient Mardaman. So I think there was more of a lasting mark in the north, and it's interesting that in many ways, in the later periods of Mesopotamian history, that is sort of from the middle of the second millennium on, middle Assyrian period on, it's really these rulers from much further north that identify from Assyria and sort of that area of sort of the northern Mesopotamia, that identify and want to connect themselves to these Akkadian kings.
Mm-hmm. I had one other question in connection with my presentation. Thank you for watching yesterday. What you think the future intentionality might have been of the Akkadian kings from their perspective in creating these monuments, in creating them in a, as you said, in a pretty uniform fashion, and what their goals were in doing that.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I liked your idea of sort of thinking about that futuricity, I think you said. I mean, I think that it's hard for us to get at what actually, the Akkadian period, it's so many layers and accretions and sort of refractions and very little actual material from the Akkadian period. But I think that where one could get at that question is in the durability of the stone. They spend a lot of time talking about getting this hard stone from far away, probably from Oman, and how this is stone that will, kind of last forever. And so I think there you could start to think about, they really want this sort of physical presence of their bodies. These are, colossal statues of them, to continue. So I think there you could think about that.
That's a great idea. Maybe I will think about that. We have some questions in the chat. Do we have any evidence of aesthetic-based collection practices in the ancient period as opposed to historical or power-based collection practices? Meaning, were people looking to group things based on their appearances? Right.
Ooh, that's a really good question. Wow. It's really hard to know, especially because aesthetics is such a complicated concept, and to the best of our ability to tease this out, and of course Irene Winter has done the most work on this, the aesthetics for the Mesopotamians were so intimately bound up with power and authority and the acquisition of precious materials, and that sort of polychromatic, multimedia types of things that I'm not sure it would be that easy for us to pull aesthetics apart from these other collecting practices. But that's a great question. Yeah.
Okay. Somebody asked that they noticed that there appear to be two suns in the Naram-Sin victory stele. Do we know what they symbolize?
Yeah, there's actually a third one too that's only very partially preserved. So it's occasioned a lot of discussion because people say, well, how can there be more than one sun? So if it's a sun, like it should only be, so are they supposed to be stars? That motif is almost exclusively used to indicate sun. And so there has been debate. And one possibility is that it's sort of meant to be the sun at various different points during the day, so that you're kind of getting a kind of sense of time. But it's still a question mark. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Wish I had a pat answer for it, but
We have another new question of what was the interaction of kings with Scrabble culture? That's a very broad question. But I guess
yeah,
in light of this Akkadian transmission of cultural memory and history.
right. Well, it seems to be pretty close. That, in other words, that these scribes are working in the courts of the kings, and so, or they're being sort of sponsored. They're sort of dependents on the palace, and so they're not kind of independent agents, but kind of working on behalf of the kings.
Okay. And then we have another bigger background question about how to think about ways in which we can preserve the historical and cultural heritage of places like in Iraq and Syria, especially in places where the current regimes aren't that interested in them, or but the local heritage still sees them as an ongoing part of
Yeah.
who they are.
Yeah, no, an excellent question. And there are a lot of organizations that are actively working today throughout the world, but the ones I know best are located in the Middle East, that are working to preserve the cultural heritage. There's the Monument Fund. I'm suddenly forgetting the exact configuration of their acronym. But they have done a lot of work in the Middle East, particularly at sites like Babylon, to try to preserve the heritage, to work with the local communities, to bring them in, and to figure out what they want to see in the historical preservation. Yeah, I would say you could go online and find a lot of the World Monument Fund. That's what it is. A lot of activity going on. It's of course, sometimes a depressing and frustrating endeavor, but a lot of people are very committed to it.
Okay. Another question coming back to the main topic of the bodily statues. Why do ancient sculptures often have missing body parts, especially the head? At least when we have found them.
Yes. Well, I mentioned very briefly about intentional mutilation. And there was a lot of intentional mutilation that went on. The general consensus is that these statues, well, even today we see this happening, right? These statues are sort of embodiments of the people. And so when they are conquered or overthrown, their statues are attacked, and heads are lopped off. So, for example, like those Gudea statues, it seems to be pretty clear that they were intentionally decapitated, because they had very short neck, and it was very, like it wouldn't just break falling over. And so it seems to have been almost every single Gudea statue that is clearly authentic is missing its head. And then there are heads that are found elsewhere. Sometimes they're just smashed, like those Manish Tushu fragments have been completely smashed. And so that seems to be just a kind of rage or annihilation type, as opposed to let's decapitate. I think the decapitation is very much meant to be like a decapitation. So yeah, there are very good reasons why so much of this statuary is in fragmentary form.
Thank you. And another question about the textual material that comes from the Akkadian period. If you could give a more deeper understanding of what types of textual material there was that refers to the Akkadian period, and if there's any of that that's directly from the Old Akkadian period that's then copied and transmitted, or if it was all later devised.
Yeah, right, right. There's very little from the actual Akkadian period. I mean, we do have some text, like we have tablets and like administrative text from the Akkadian period. And there are some royal display inscriptions, like the fragmentary one on the Naram Sin stele and on some of the Manish Tushu. And there's some Shar Kali Shari inscriptions that have survived. But there was for quite a while a lot of debate about whether these later collections of inscriptions by these later scribes, whether they were kind of making them up because we didn't have any actual ones from the Akkadian period that survived, with the exception of some of Manish Tushu's inscriptions. But there has been this recent find that I mentioned from what they think is the ancient Kesh, where there is actually a fragment now of one of these campaign descriptions. So something more than just I am, the king and whatever, but actually giving more of that, and it matches one of these inscriptions from it's a fragment from what we know from a larger inscription from one of these collections. So they do appear to be pretty accurate copies.
Okay, great. Somebody would like to know what the title of your forthcoming book is. So
it's
a plug.
It's very, very appropriately remembering and forgetting in ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Sumer. I can't remember which one I decided, but yeah, ziggurats, Akkadian royal monuments, and ziggurat, something like that. Yeah, but remembering and forgetting in ancient Mesopotamia. So
Okay.
it's still got a little ways to go. It's due out late next year, late 2025.
Another question about temporality and periodicity. What did these the way you presented this is going through the history, starting from the Old Akkadian period and then moving through step by step and showing who understood things about the Akkadian kings and what they took out of it. But do you think that they had some concept of periodicity? I know that they had some decent idea of time depth in at different times, at least in the Neo-Babylonian texts that I discussed. But did they feel like these old Akkadian kings were different from them and for a different era, and that there were eras in between, or did they think that this was just a continuous history that was part of their own past?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question, and I think it varies a little bit from period to period. So obviously, those periods that are closer in time to the Akkadian period, like the Ur III and the Old Babylonian period, that's still within hundreds of years memory, and so I think there was more of a sort of sense of the tangible reality that is less by the time you get to the end of the second millennium and into the first millennium, where there really is this it's a much bigger gulf in time. And so you get Nabonidus is saying that, and maybe David, you can even correct me, does he say that Naram Sin reigned 3,800 years before him, something like that?
3,200 years, yeah.
3,200 years, which is 2x the amount of time. But
it's not crazy how in terms of it's the right scale. He's talking about these Kassite kings and other inscriptions, and he says 800 years, and he's pretty close.
Right. So I think there's definitely, they have a pretty good sense actually of time, and I think that in many ways the fact that they build out of mud brick that needs to be renewed sort of every generation or so, and that piles up over time, and they can dig down, they have a really very physical way of digging through time and having a sense of that being time. So I do think they had a sense of history in that way.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your talk today and for presenting at the conference. I think it was really great.
Well,
And
thank you for having me.
very welcome.